Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan, for inviting me. It's an honor. I will speak a bit under 40 minutes. Bear with me, just so you know that after half an hour you don't get impatient. Oh, he's still going on and on. 38 minutes.
We want to hear you. Go ahead.
I have a confession to make. Not so easy, especially in a forum like ours, but I'll do it. I have a confession to make. Although this talk is, of course, not at all about me, I deem it necessary to state that I'm not a great reader. Never have been. Not sure I ever will be. On the other hand, I partly grew up in a bookshop, owned by my Viennese uncles who established Libris in London, boasting the largest stock of German literature in all of England, a mecca for scholars and connoisseurs. I always felt as though through osmosis, I had taken in the contents of this heavenly place, from the cellar up to the third floor, 10,000s of books. The troublesome reality of my being a bad reader has helped me from the outset, I've always believed, to dare to begin writing my own books, my short stories, novels, biographies, essays. Yet as soon as I decide upon a new theme, a new topic which necessitates any form of research, I do read by digging deep and ever deeper into the cosmos of the world's literatures, and then suddenly I do turn into a reader par excellence. When I was asked to speak about Jean Améry's last book, Charles Bovary, Country Doctor, Portrait of a Simple Man, published 5 weeks before his suicide in mid-October 1978, I had never before read any of Améry's work, did not know his essays At the Mind's Limit, On Aging, Revolt and Resignation, or Hand an sich legen, On Suicide, a Discourse on Voluntary Death, nor his essayistic novel about his close friend, the painter Erich Schmidt, published as Le Feu, or The Demolition. But I had known Jean Améry personally, this very kind, sensitive, soft-spoken man. He was a friend of my parents. I will get to that later. Accepting the challenge meant, of course, that I would have to not only read Améry's Country Doctor, but Gustave Flaubert for the first time in my life as well. Unimaginable to discuss Améry's analysis of Flaubert without knowing the source material he refers to. I decided to turn the reading experience around and took to Améry's book first, without the least knowledge of Flaubert's famous novel, apart from the detail that its heroine, not a spoiler alert, I assume, commits suicide in the end. Améry's book is neither novel nor essay, but rather a mixture of both, a so-called novel essay, which blends fiction and non-fiction in a highly original way, a literary form Améry had already used 4 years earlier for his Le Feu. This idiosyncratic format would doubtless have vexed booksellers and librarians when it was first published in German in 1978. The reviewer Human Barekat remarked in The Guardian, when Charles Bovary, Country Doctor, was published in English only in 2018, 40 years after it came out in German. Today, he continued, we call it creative nonfiction and scarcely bat an eyelid. 3 of the 6 chapters are pure literary criticism, philosophical tract. The 3 others, novelistic fictional monologue. In his brutal indictment of Flaubert, Améry makes the following observation. Emma Bovary's cheated on husband, the simple country doctor Charles is mistreated as a pitiful nobody by his creator, a Claude presented as neither particularly intelligent nor in any way attractive, not sensitive, not compassionate, not caring. A ridiculous bumpkin whose beautiful, luscious wife is no match for him at all. He rubs her the wrong way on a daily basis. Charles Bovary, the poor man from whom everything was stripped away, I am quoting Améry, love, his beloved, his possessions, and even his memory, for as he is forced to realize he has lived in error, was treated by Gustave Flaubert as a quantité négligeable. He comes to see himself as victim and bearer of fatalité, as a man of the abyss. Flaubert's Charles Bovary was a dimwit, end quote. Améry claims that Gustave Flaubert, the haut bourgeois, looked down upon the petit bourgeois, which Charles represented, fictional though he may be, ridiculing his own creation up to the very last moments of his protagonist's life, denying him the rights of liberty, equality, and fraternity the French Revolution had fought for, the pillars of enlightenment. Améry's goal is to rectify this alleged massive injustice inflicted upon poor Charles, an objective he executes with unrelenting passion, suggesting that indeed there was more to the man than Gustave Flaubert makes us believe. And then there is another central accusation Améry levels against Flaubert, that the novelist betrayed his own entrenchment in the genre of literary realism by inventing a character who Améry claims is not at all realistic, not at all believable. Which husband, madly in love with his wife, would willfully deliver her to her lovers? No one believes that, I'm quoting. The novelist's invention is a bad one, this one and so many more. Améry writes in one of the book's chapters focusing on literary criticism that the country doctor failed to notice his wife's first playful flirtations with Léon, that he eagerly advised her to go riding with the notorious lady killer Rodolphe, that nothing awakened suspicion in his heart. The reader can hardly accept all that. The book has rightfully been interpreted as a polemic answer to Jean-Paul Sartre's 4,092-page unfinished biography of Flaubert in 3 parts. L'idiot de la famille. By the way, Sartre's esoteric masterwork is considered to be his least read. I certainly did not read it, I can assure you. L'idiot de la famille may even have been the main trigger event for Améry to undertake his novel essay in the first place. He had been one of Sartre's most passionate admirers, a disciple even, had written in Sartre's shadow for years. But in 1974, he began to turn into an adversary of France's most prominent living philosopher of the time, after Sartre had visited the convicted German terrorist Andreas Baader in prison at Stammheim near Stuttgart. After his meeting with Baader, Sartre leveled heavy accusations against the West German government. The Rote Armee Fraktion prisoners were being held in solitary confinement in soundproofed cells with constant artificial lighting. It was not torture like that of the Nazis, Sartre said, but another torture, a torture that leads to psychological disturbance, Sartre proclaimed. In fact, the philosopher had never even seen the cells at the newly constructed prison, which were equipped with television sets and small libraries. Perhaps Sartre, by then half blind, had mistaken the meager visitor's room for Baader's prison cell. Améry must have felt disappointment and pure anger at such remarks by his former idol, who dared comparing, even if only elusively, the Nazi henchman's torture he had to endure in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen to what the members of the RAF were facing in a German high-security prison. In Charles Bovary, Country Doctor, Améry reproaches Sartre for his excessive fascination for Flaubert, the bourgeois, overlooking the man of the people, the doctor of humble origins. On the other hand, it was Sartre who in his L'idiot de la famille had argued that Charles Bovary is, in a way, perhaps Madame Bovary's main protagonist, the novel being held together by Charles's persona from the very beginning to the very end. In his dialogue with Sartre, Améry writes, Sartre's Flaubert is the Sartre Flaubert and should remain such. It is now left to others to discover their own Flaubert according to the map each sketches out for himself. End quote. Let us take a closer look at the way Améry sketches out the map of his own grievances against Flaubert and the handling, or rather mishandling, of its protagonist. His novel essay starts out with the chapter Threnody, a flamboyant monologue written in empurpled style, mourning the death of his beloved wife shortly after her suicide on the day of her funeral. It tells us the story from the point of view of Charles several days, weeks, or perhaps months before his own downfall. Her creditors are at the door. Charles is alone without money or society, a ruined and nervous man. Améry renders Charles' thoughts as stream of consciousness, but in turgid, stilted language, at least in the German original. At times, Améry tries to copy the rhythm of Thomas Bernhard's prose, whose oeuvre he certainly knew well. I have read, I may add, Bernhard's novels almost in their entirety, but sadly never even comes close to Bernhard's genius. Au contraire, in the text's fictional parts, Améry's language sounds tremendously old-fashioned. Just to give you a random example in the German original first. Auch Mutters Rede setzte mir die Gemarkung meiner Welt. Keine Üppigkeit, es sei denn beim Sonntagsmahl mit Poulet à l'Estragon, keine Hoffahrt. Hoffahrt und Hochfahrt. Ich stieß die Grenzsteine als ich mir das schönste Mädchen des Departements zum E-Weib erkor. The English translation sounds more digestible. Mother's words too mark the boundaries of my world. Nothing sumptuous beyond the Sunday meal of poulet à l'estragon, nothing uppity, nothing lofty. I overturned the border stones when I set my sights on the most beautiful girl in the département. How surprising and certainly satisfying it would have been had Améry chosen, even more so in the context of this experimental novel essay, to use a particularly modern style and language. He does exactly the opposite, writing prose reminiscent of the 19th century. Améry, one of the most well-read, erudite, knowledgeable individuals of his time, knew, of course, what he was doing. But why he decided to do so, I cannot comprehend. It even hurts my feelings in a certain indefinable way. Then again, this strange hybrid of a book changes tone completely when its author shifts to the chapters of literary criticism, in which he pleads his case like a capable attorney before a court of law in wild rhetorical tirades. The idea of the juxtaposition of fictional passages with those of pure critical review works well to a certain degree. But even where pure critical review is at the center, the style lacks clarity and the power to convince. It often sounds like gibberish. Whether there are, I'm quoting, or are not elementary particles, which one refers to as quarks, is indifferent to the world of personal experiences so long, but only so long, as no propositions derived from the quark hypothesis lead to a change in the individual and social structures of existence. Believe me, this randomly chosen passage doesn't sound more convincing in the German original. The more I got to know of Charles Bovary, Country Doctor, the more clearly I realized that it assumes its reader must be at least somewhat familiar with Flaubert's novel. So I read Améry in a kind of blind flight mode regarding the source material he attacks on every page. The book's last chapter, J'accuse, culminates in a mock court hearing in which Flaubert is judged by Charles Bovary, who makes his final plea. Gentlemen of the court, Monsieur Gustave Flaubert expelled me from the realm of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and made me into a serf of what was for him the stupidity and ugliness of the petite bourgeoisie. I accuse him, and I demand the restoration of all rights due to me, what my spirit, my era, and history had reserved for me, but which the miser, the cheat, the malign weaver of words and pretty pictures refused me. Go to his distinguished Hermitage and arrest him. Gag his mouth if he begins capriciously to growl, listening in rapture to his own cadences, which are as beautiful to him as I was ugly. Gustave Flaubert, I was nothing to you. Charles talks back to his creator. The final statement ends with the words, Je vous accuse, Monsieur Flaubert, only to be retracted a few pages later when Charles proclaims, no, do not rise to issue the verdict. I rescind my accusation. I slowly but surely began longing for Améry's 160-page book to end, I must admit, allowing me to move on and to finally start reading Madame Bovary. But first, I still needed to get through the final pages in which Améry lets Charles Bovary's Don Quixote-like outbursts culminate in fantasies of the doctor's decision to poison Emma's two lovers, as well as an awkward vision, painful to read, of an orgy involving Rodolphe, Léon, and himself. Rodolphe, Léon, she wants you both, one at a time and together. She likes that. One pleasure her head, the other her feet, and the middle belongs to all three of us. Beauty commands this, fate demands it. And you, Homais, the apothecary, one of the novel's main protagonists, you, Homais, see to the pleasure of all four of us intertwined. Monsieur l'Abbé, bless this exquisite love game. I want it, do it. She likes blows from the whip too, and her cries of pain are jubilant lust. Nor does Améry shy away from allusions to seminal discharge, die fließende Erlösung, which the translator doesn't really catch when he refers to Charles's fluid resolution, or ich genieße das Fließen meines Bluts und des klebrigen weißlichen Liquidiums, which we read as I enjoy my flowing blood and the tacky whitish liquid, in Adrian Nathan West's sober translation. Are all these rather embarrassing moments variations on themes and scenes from Flaubert's original, I kept asking myself? Or are they purely born out of Améry's fantasy? I have nothing against orgies. But in this context, I felt strangely appalled. When on top of these erotic escapades, moments of necrophilia occurred throughout, a vile perversion, I'm quoting, and let me warn you, a criminal offense, as Charles declares in Améry's book, I tended to quickly scan the sentences without reading them all too carefully, again and again wondering, are they derived from the original, or does Améry allow himself to be carried away into a realm for which he feels a rather sickening personal attraction? The moment had finally arrived to read Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. I cherished the first pages, then the next, and the next. It felt almost comparable to escaping a bad dream, or reminiscent of immersing oneself in a huge warm bubble bath filled to the brim after a particularly cold, windy, exhausting day, feeling immediate relief. What a captivating, exquisite novel with all of its lush details, its moments of sadness and bliss. But most of all, I encountered Emma Bovary's husband, Charles, a country doctor who falls in love with one of the département's most beautiful girls, marries her and starts a family with her. The story of Madame Bovary is based on two local dramas, the adultery and subsequent suicide of the wife of a local country doctor, and the disastrous spending habits and ultimate financial ruin of the wife of a sculptor Flaubert knew personally. A third influence on the novel was the regional fiction of Balzac, whom Flaubert greatly admired. Incited, truly hyped up by Jean Améry's novel essay, I expected to encounter a ridiculous cuckold at the center of Flaubert's most famous work, Charles Bovary, a simpleton to the extreme, completely devoid of compassion for his exquisite wife. How great was my surprise to engage, from the first page to the very last, with a warm-hearted, kind, considerate young man. He's a widower after the death of his unloved first wife, Eloise. Emma, his second wife, is the incarnation of beauty and passion. He adores her every move. His devotion to her knows no boundaries. What I learned was, in fact, an inverse reality to what Améry had prepared me for. Charles may be a little naive, no doubt, and he is all too soft, certainly not what we in our times would call macho. On the contrary, how can he be only dull and narrow-minded if he mustered the courage to ask for Emma's hand in marriage? Yes, it's true. He never suspects any of Emma's betrayals. He either turns a blind eye, or rather, he just doesn't get it. Apart from these character traits, he certainly isn't a great physician, just a simple country doctor who spends his days visiting patients in the wider surroundings. A good man who, when faced with the challenge of performing his first operation ever, the correction of a club foot, fails abysmally. I began to suffer for Charles whenever Emma berated him. She starts doing so very early on in their marriage, making fun of him, deriding him for his clumsiness, taunting him for intellectual shortcomings. It now seemed to me that Flaubert's sympathies were perhaps closer to Charles than to Emma. No man could ever give her what she wanted. Her idea of man was a picture of gallantry, fashion, and passion. The Indian writer Ankita Chakraborty states, even in death, she still seemed to be expecting all men to live up to that idea, to strive to be deserving of her. Flaubert's insatiable heroine seems not only cruel, scheming, and cold-hearted, but solely responsible for her husband's complete bankruptcy. Flaubert does not pass judgment on his protagonists, yet I could not overlook a certain disdain on his part for Emma's extravagant behavior and her constant nastiness toward her husband. Charles came to kiss her on the shoulder. We read early on in Madame Bovary, "Leave me alone," she said. "You're rumpling me." Often when they're sitting down to have dinner together, Emma reads in her books while he eats, paying no attention whatsoever to Charles. When she cannot stand living in the tiny village of Tost any longer, she grew pale and had palpitations of the heart. I'm quoting. Charles administered valerian and camphor baths. Everything he tried seemed to irritate her further. He decides to try setting up his practice somewhere else and finds a solution after intense attempts to leave his hometown of many years. After looking here and there, Charles learned that in the region of Neufchâtel, there was a sizable market town called Yonville-l'Abbé, whose doctor, a Polish refugee, had just decamped the week before. They moved to Yonville, while Emma is pregnant with their only child, their daughter Berthe. And here in Yonville, Emma's first passionate love affair soon begins with the landowner, the wealthy landowner and ladies' man, Rodolphe Boulanger de la Huchette. They plan to start a new life together. Emma is preparing her flight, only to learn on the day of their departure that Rodolphe has backed down and left town. She spirals into a complete nervous breakdown. I'm quoting, "They thought she was delirious, and she was, from midnight on. A brain fever had set in. For 43 days, Charles did not leave her side. He abandoned all his patients. He no longer went to bed. Speak to us," Charles was saying. "Speak to us. Wake up. It's me, your Charles, who loves you. Do you recognize me?" I would go so far as to state Charles Bovary is in reality the soul of Flaubert's novel, the putty, the cement that holds the entire novel together. At 7 o'clock, I'm quoting, little Berthe, who had not seen him all afternoon, came to call him for dinner. We read on the novel's very last page, "His head was leaning back against the wall, his eyes were closed, his mouth open, and he was holding in his hands a long lock of black hair. 'Papa, come,' she said. And thinking that he wanted to play, she pushed him gently. He fell to the ground. He was dead." Mistreatment of Charles Bovary by his creator, Gustave Flaubert? Mais pas du tout. Absolutely not. Rather, an affectionate understanding for a man, a husband, a country doctor, who remains far too soft, who cannot help himself. I often eavesdrop on couples in restaurants, on trains, in planes, in the subway, where a husband allows his wife to berate him, criticize him, tease him, and he remains stoically silent. Although it upsets me at times, I completely understand the men's decision not to fight back, to keep their cool. In my biography of Franz Werfel, we learn that Alma Mahler was completely overpowering her spouse. He took it in stride, even allowing his wife her extramarital affairs. Does that mean he was a fool, a weakling, a ridiculous nobody? No, by no means. Was my father a fool, a weakling, a ridiculous nobody, because he chose to let the frequent rants of my mother, a particularly strong personality, often go unanswered, very rarely fighting back? No, by no means. By the way, Charles' death in Madame Bovary reminded me of a news item from late May of this year, after the horrific mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Joe Garcia, the husband of Irma Garcia, one of the two teachers killed in the massacre, had just placed flowers at the memorial site of his beloved wife of 24 years. When he returned home, he sat down at a kitchen table surrounded by family and suddenly collapsed. Efforts to revive him were unsuccessful. He had simply died of grief. Allow me to once again turn my attention to Améry's, I cannot help myself from saying it, flawed novel essay, his whiny misinterpretation, Charles Bovary, Country Doctor, Portrait of a Simple Man. A simple man? Really? Even these 5 words in the book's title are misleading. Jean Améry is the one who reduces Charles Bovary to being a nitwit, certainly not Gustave Flaubert. Relieved that Flaubert does not allow necrophilia to invade his Madame Bovary in any way, I needed to look up one of the passages in Améry's book, which I had more or less skipped at first. I'm now doing the exact opposite, even quoting these gruesome sentences. In fact, the prose seethes at times with necrophiliac desire, to make my point that its author had in a certain way lost his bearings, allowing his dark fantasies to take hold in one of Charles's stream of consciousness monologues. Just 2 miles more to Yonville and another half to the church field where you await your 3 lovers. Charles, Rodolphe, Léon, in whom all contradictions are resolved if they fetch your rotting cadaver. Perhaps it would be right for me to crawl on my knees to Yonville, to scrape away my skin, and to embrace your skeleton as a skeleton in turn. Don't let filth in the village say the country doctor came stumbling home, a drunk who did away with his wife's 2 lovers, poisoning them after all 3 had committed necrophilia with his wife's body. End quote. Gulp. The book came out in September 1978. In a letter to his devoted friend and publisher Michael Klett of Klett Cotta in Stuttgart, who had brought out all his previous books, and I think also brought out the complete works very recently, Améry wrote, die ersten Besprechungen erwarte ich mit einiger Ungeduld, da es keine richtigen Kriterien gibt in der Literatur, ist die Herausgabe jedes neuen Werkes eine Art Va-banque-Spiel. I await the first reviews with some impatience. Since there are no real criteria in literature, the publication of each new work is a kind of gambling game. I reached out to Michael Klett, who was once my publisher as well, who told me that none of his friends' books sold as badly as this last one, Charles Bovary, but quickly shifted our conversation to an outburst of affection for his author. He often came to visit us at home. Klett recalls what a sweet and kind man he was, a causeur whose colloquial intensity knew no boundaries. He seemed to constantly run after the life he felt had been taken away from him during the war. He loved playing with our then still small children in the garden, unhappy perhaps to have never had children of his own. The kids loved him back. They owned quite a number of pets, among them 4 Tanzmäuse, waltzing mice, mice of a genetic variant characterized by an inability to progress in a straight line and a tendency to whirl about in small circles. They can do nothing but turn, 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 incessantly. Améry was deeply shocked to see this and reprimanded us for ever allowing our children to play with a living being who obviously suffers terribly from its disabilities. We quickly gave them away. It seems that the first reviews were slow in coming. Améry embarked on a reading tour through Germany of Charles Bovary, which took him to Hamburg, Kiel, Neumünster, and Oldenburg. Not long ago, a few weeks ago actually, I visited Sidney Rosenfeld, the translator of Améry's key work, Jenseits von Schuld und Sühne, among others, at his home in Oberlin, Ohio. In Germany, I heard Améry read twice from his Charles Bovary book. Sidney Rosenfeld, who recently turned 91 years old, told me, I remember being truly disappointed. It didn't seem to come close to the stylistic brilliance I was so used to in his work. Although I didn't know everything he had written, he implored me never to read Hand an sich legen, his book on suicide. He felt guilty that a German student who read it took his life following the book's advice. As mentioned in the beginning, I had the great privilege of meeting Jean Améry on several occasions when I grew up and later in my early 20s. He was a friend of my parents, Ruth and Robert Jungk, visiting them in their lovely apartment overlooking Salzburg's fortress, the churches, the river Salzach with its bridges. I remember a soft-spoken, particularly kind man, a chain smoker like I had never seen, whose deep voice and very slow, cautious way of speaking impressed me. But I found it also quite worrisome how sad and destroyed he looked. In his early 60s, he seemed at least 10 years older, extremely thin, extremely pale, with deep wrinkles and large bags under his eyes, which sat deep within their sockets, protected by heavy eyelids. The tremendous suffering he had endured was clearly written into his furrowed facial expressions, which constantly seemed as though close to tears. Well, actually, the slight smile we see on the poster is the absolute exception. His smiles were very rare. During his reading tour through Germany, he had a few days off. Before the planned continuation in Mannheim, Heidelberg, Karlsruhe, the Frankfurt Book Fair, among other venues, he called my mother in Salzburg, asking her to reserve a room for him at the hotel she had always recommended to him for its luxurious rooms, the charming restaurant and perfect location in the center of town, directly on the banks of the river. The österreichische Hof, since the year 2000 known as the Hotel Sacher. You may have guessed what happened next. It was in this hotel room, which my mother had reserved for him, that Jean Améry, born Hans Meyer in Vienna on October 31, 1912, took his life on October 16, 1978, with an overdose of sleeping pills, exactly 2 weeks before his 66th birthday. It is no coincidence, I believe, that Améry chose Salzburg for the last hours of his life. He had spent rather happy years as a child nearby in Bad Ischl, in the Salzkammergut, where he lived with his mother after the death of his father. My mother felt guilty in a certain way for what had happened in that hotel room of the Österreichische Hof, which of course she wasn't in the least to blame for, but still, the shock stayed with her throughout the rest of her life. It is my belief that even before the first truly negative reviews regarding Charles Bovary Landarzt came out, Améry sensed that a fear he had always had was now returning with a vengeance. The realization that he may have failed as a novelist, that he may be the hack writer, the failure he had long considered himself to be. From the start, Améry's hope was to be a literary writer, a Schriftsteller, a romancier. His literary hopes had been dashed once before, after his novel essay Le Feu oder der Abbruch came out. A damning review by Germany's leading literary critic, Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung under the title Schrecklich ist die Verführung zum Roman. What a terrible seduction it is to write a novel, had triggered a prolonged, deep depression in Améry just weeks after his first failed suicide attempt in February 1974. Améry was no Schriftsteller, Reich-Ranitzky had written in his review, but merely a scribbler. At any rate, the literary critics of the time gave him the clear impression of failure. I have no proof for my assumption, but I do believe that Améry's close friend Fritz Radatz, the prolific literary critic, may have informed him that he did not think he had succeeded with Charles Bovary Country Doctor, and prepared him for the fact that he would be publishing a rather unfriendly review in Die Zeit in the days to come. I'm quoting, Améry does not prove to be a convincing narrator here, Radatz wrote. On the contrary, it is clearer than ever before that he does not master his great themes of senility and eros narratively. Even more than in earlier books, passages of lonely old age sexuality slip into his embarrassing, even tacky prose. Able editors should have talked him out of such scenes of ardent, panting yearning. One reacts with great reluctance to such literary impossibility, end quote. The review appeared 2 days after Améry's death. He must have felt that he had set out on a precarious, possibly faulty track when attacking Flaubert's greatest novel, facing the inevitability of renewed failure concerning his novel essay that had just come out a few weeks prior, certainly precipitated his demise. Of course, the one review by Radatz alone cannot have been the reason for Jean Améry's suicide. But if he had prior knowledge of it, as I suspect, that reality certainly didn't stop him from executing his well-prepared plan in the soft bed sheets of a beautifully furnished Salzburg hotel room. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful, lucid and very intense analysis and your private or your personal view on Jean Améry. I think there are quite a lot of questions right now. Mario Kessler to begin with.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I have to admit, your presentation knocked me almost down. Yeah? No,
it's not very nice
I'm sorry to say.
In a conference about Jean Améry to be so berating.
Yeah.
But
and
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no. And the reason is, I was 25, 26. I lived in the DDR, and I read, the book was not forbidden in the DDR. I read a collection of essays about the angry old men, die zornigen alten Männer, edited by Axel Eggebrecht. Among the contributors were Osip Flechtheim, with work I'm particularly familiar because I wrote his biography, and also Wolfgang Abendroth, who shared a similar fate with Améry, because he also survived a torture under the Nazis from which he never ever recovered. Yeah, and Wolfgang Abendroth and Jean Améry, they had two complete opposite strategy to survive it. Améry wrote his moving essay about torture. Wolfgang Abendroth did particularly the opposite. He never wrote about it, and only after he died. Then his wife, I knew, she confessed that every night he was crying out. The nightmares came back. Yeah? And also Abendroth tried to commit suicide. Unfortunately, he did not succeed and became one of the most important and forceful people of the post-war German left. My question is, do you have any idea, or did your parents, Robert Jungk and Ruth Tuschitsky, ever mentioned that Améry was befallen by kinds of nightmares? I cannot imagine.
Kinds of what?
Of nightmares. I cannot imagine.
Sure.
To write an essay, what he did about suicide, not to live under constant suffering. And the other question, which for which nobody of us has a real answer, is how to survive. Is there any way? Is there any way how to cope with this personal past? Améry failed. How to do it not to fail?
I'm not completely sure that I understood your question, though. You mean, did he have nightmares? I mean, apart from the fact that this is now many years ago that he has died and that my parents knew him or I knew him, how could he not have had nightmares every night? I mean, it's impossible. If he was a human being, of course. No question. Susan.
Susan.
He does, in his wonderfully elegant way, make a remark, and I forget which essay this is now, about, you know, thanks to the blessings of the chemical industry, I can sleep. So.
Well, probably in Hand an sich legen.
No, it's not in that. It's in one of the other ones. I wanted to propose something. Because we have quite deliberately scheduled 3 talks on Charles Bovary today, which I'm assuming will give 3 very different takes on the book. Unfortunately, the next talk is scheduled for Zoom because Jan-Philipp Reemsma at the last minute couldn't be here. And so, I mean, I found your talk fascinating, by the way, and I look forward to hearing from James also.
I do too.
About the, you know, sort of serendipity of the order in which one reads things.
Of course.
Because I have a very different take, and I've read Charles Bovary now 3 times, the last time just finished yesterday, and Madame Bovary, which I confess I never liked, largely because I don't like Emma. Now I'm not reading it in French, so possibly I'm missing the reasons why everybody thinks it's one of the great 19th century novels, but
I do, yeah.
Anyway, but
so you're proposing that we speak afterwards?
I'm wondering about that just because I'm worried. I mean, if people have very specific questions for you for another 5 minutes or so, you're shaking your head.
I hate to disagree, but we need a bit of a technical break anyway, so that would, I don't know whether Reemsma is ready now, so I would say let's have 5 or 10 more minutes at least for the special questions, and we'll come back to this anyway. So it doesn't make any sense to just have a break now because.
No, I was also going to suggest 5-10 minutes, but not.
So
more
let's see if there are
course,
questions.
Just to have, I'm pretty sure that there are some questions, for example, for your own experience also with Améry, which wouldn't fit afterwards after Reemsma's probably very different take. Anyway, no, well, it's probably, yeah.
But are there any questions? That's the big question. Moshe.
Moshe Halbertal.
Well, thanks. This was such an exquisite and beautiful talk.
Thank you, Moshe.
Really is. I want to ask about suicide. You're presenting I don't know if an explanation, but a background. But it's the dependency of a person on a review or on a reception, not a review, a reception, is possible only if he doesn't have any anchor out there. Because people who have been through that, who have gone through that, have somewhere to lean on, right? Somewhere inside or outside to lean on. So that frailty is a function of a whole past, including, by the way, the need to be received, because he has a point when he speaks about in one of his essays actually about being Jewish, he said, here's this author who said, how could this be done to a German author? And he says, you're not a German author if you don't have an audience, right? So there is a whole thing that we have to take into account. I mean, this is not by way of questioning.
No, it's a comment.
But it's you wonder. I mean, you feel so heartbroken by the dependency that brings you to such uttermost despair.
But in Améry's case, from what I understand, he wanted so much to be loved as a novelist, and it just never worked. And it must have been so frustrating for him. And I read somewhere, I think in the bad biography we spoke about yesterday, that the only reviews he remembered were the terrible ones. Daniel has never had a bad review, so he doesn't know about this. He doesn't know the feeling. Believe me, I'm not thinking of suicide, but a bad review goes very far into your body. It's like a projectile.
But we overcome it, or people overcome
Of course, of course.
by an anchor somewhere.
If we have our strong sense of ourselves and have not been tortured, we can deal with it. But he must have felt it like a torture to get these. I mean, this one, just the title of Reichenitsky's review. I mean, can you believe how you feel after that? Schrecklich ist die Versuchung, einen Roman zu schreiben.
Well, he was famous for that, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really resonated not only about Bob Jungk or Axel Eggebrecht, the angry old men, like Ossip Flechtheim and all these. So what do I do with my anger? Do I really make such a book? And what would this book look like today?
That's an interesting question, which is impossible to answer because we cannot read into the historical changes that would have happened in his life. I think it would be impossible. The publisher would not have taken it. Even his friend Michael Klett would have told him, Jean, I'm sorry, now in this new world, which I find in a way sad. I'm all for publishing it. But Michael Klett would say, I'm sorry, in this new world, we cannot publish a book like this. I mean, I've only quoted a few sentences that are of this horror, it's not possible today.
James Wood, oh sorry, Susan, would you just that to the point, or?
Well, it is. I mean, I would like to carry on this discussion when we've had all three discussions, but I really have to protest. I would much rather read this book than anything of Thomas Bernhardt's. And I don't find, you talked about the prose being old-fashioned.
Completely.
Yeah, he's thinking himself into the 19th century.
Did you read it in German or in English?
German. He's thinking himself into the 19th century.
Terrible style.
I think we should have this out later, but I just had to put in a word for the idea that I actually think it's an impressive book on third reading.
But
not the final chapter. The final chapter has bothered me this time, but yeah.
James Wood.
Less a question than a kind of expression of outrage. And by the way, I know something about negative reviews, being not only someone who's given them, and I now I detest that side of me that used to review like that. But as a critic who's written a couple of ill-received novels, shall we say, the last one, the review in the Times of London, you have to understand a pun in English here on my name, Wood, was would that he were good. Yeah. Funny. I mean, funnier than, but once you've seen that, you think, okay, I don't need to read the review now. Anyway, my question, outrage question, is how can Raddatz actually have been his friend and written that review?
I didn't hear that.
How can, it was Raddatz for his name, yeah?
Raddatz, yes.
How could he have been a friend and actually written that review?
Very good
It's
question.
not compatible with any...
Very good, but Raddatz is a complicated personality. I'm not sure, Daniel, did you know him, Fritz Raddatz?
Yeah, actually, I never met him,
in his posthumously published diaries about the fact that I never called him. As someone who doesn't, like some then young novelist who publishes books, it's like, why isn't he calling me? So I only learned that posthumously from those diaries, and I was also very surprised reading those diaries.
Interesting.
That he never mentions books in his diaries. It's always about whom he goes to dinner with.
Yeah, he was a star
About
fucker.
his social life.
Total star fucker.
Yeah, but you would think someone whose life is actually who makes a living on reading books, that somehow that would seep into the diaries, but it doesn't. So, but I never met him. But he actually complains about me not having met him.
And I partook in, I think, his 40th birthday in Hamburg. I was 16, so we would have to look it up if it was his 40th, but I think it was. And I was, for the first time, really drunk. And we stayed at his house, my parents and I, overnight. And I will spare you the details. I'm not Améry and Charles Bovary. What happened in that night to me, it was horror. So for me, Raddatz is always linked to my first Vollrausch, to my first champagne. Complete drunkenness. Horrible. But that wasn't his fault. That was mine. No, but he was a weirdo, to say the least.
There is a form of resentment about not being an author himself, right?
Of course.
And I'm glad it's not a conference on Fritz J. Raddatz. But I would like, for a final question, to come back to his style, the Améry style you mentioned already. And in a way, I think Susan is right. He thinks to go back to the 19th century. On the other hand, I always had the impression that also in his other books, in his essays, that he sometimes has at least for a German reader of, say, our generation, it is something very narrow, very strange use of words sometimes say. I give you just one example, and that is he always writes Tortur, if he means Folter, which is for an English audience not
clearly understandable.
Torture,
Yeah.
that is a normal word for it, but Tortur in German is very, very unusual. You wouldn't say that normally, and it's even a bit, it's not as strong as you would say with Folter. And I always had the idea that why? Of course, he lived in Belgium and so on, and he had this French background. But I always had the impression that it might be some sort of trying to bring reality on a distance via language. This old-fashioned style he sometimes used is...
Although I found it interesting that his translator said that in Bovary he felt that it was so much less convincing, the style, compared to his other books. Not knowing all his other books, I have difficulties making that comparison.
So said,
we have to,
this discussion.
but we can still speak about questions you may have later.
We'll have now a 25 minutes break. We